I'm really delighted to be able to introduce this panel. My name is Patrick Dineen. I'm the interim director of the Center for Ethics and Culture for this spring 2018 semester. The Center for Ethics and Culture, for those of you not familiar with our work, is committed to sharing the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual traditions through its teaching, research, and dialogue, which is pursued through a variety of events and initiatives on campus and in the public square. And this event, I think, being one of our really signature academic events of the year, bringing together this group of really stellar scholars to talk about a really important book. Those of you who may not yet know more about the center are welcome to learn more at the table up here. And for those of you who are confident about the weather in the future, there are free t-shirts available as well. You can find out more about the Soren Fellows program for graduate and undergraduate students, among other things. This program is also co-sponsored by the program in Constitutional Studies, of which I'm a faculty member as well, and I'm delighted. Those of you interested in learning more about the program in Constitutional Studies, I see Jen Smith, our administrator back there in the red coat. Please speak with her if you'd like to learn more about Constitutional Studies. There are books for sale. The book we'll be discussing here tonight, this afternoon. And I'm told that they're half price, which means they're almost affordable, $22.50, which is about as good a price I think you'll get for this particular volume. So I encourage you to pick one up today, maybe a one-day fire sale. Freedom from Reality is one of a book series that is being sponsored by the Center for Ethics and Culture through Notre Dame University Press. The series is entitled Catholic Ideas for a Secular World, and it features works that emphasize and engage the enduring themes of human dignity and the common good in ways that reflect and deepen the principles affirmed by the Catholic Church for millennia. I'm grateful today to have the director of Notre Dame Press, Steve Wren, here joining us as well. Our panelists are the author of this book, Freedom from Reality, The Diabolical Character of Modern Liberalism, David, or D.C. Schindler, who is an associate professor of metaphysics and anthropology at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute in Washington, D.C. He's a graduate of our own PLS, Program in Liberal Studies, here at Notre Dame, and received his PhD at the Catholic University of America in 2001, and had taught previously at Villanova University from 2001 to 2013, first as a fellow in the philosophy department and then in the Department of Humanities. Feel free to come in, grab a bite to eat, and as you finish your meals, feel free also to have coffee and dessert on the back table there. Our first respondent will be Professor Peter Simpson, who's a professor of philosophy at the City University of New York, as well as a professor of philosophy and classics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He studied classics at Oxford and received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Manchester. Professor Simpson is taught at the Catholic University of America, University College Dublin, and Manchester Polytechnic. He is the author of Political Illiberalism, A Defense of Freedom, and The Nature and Politics of Aristotle. And I could also commend a superb translation of Aristotle's Politics that I've used often in my own classes. Second, we'll hear from Adam Seagrave, a PhD from our own Department of Political Science here at Notre Dame with a specialty in American political thought. He joined the Department of Political Science at the University of Missouri in 2016 and is also a Kinder Institute Associate Professor of Constitutional Democracy at the University of Missouri. And lastly, we'll hear from someone perhaps known to many of you, Professor Michael Moreland, who is a university professor of law and religion and director of the Eleanor H. McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy at Villanova University. He joined the faculty there in 2006 and served as vice dean from 2012 to 2015. But most recently, again, familiar to many of us because he served as the Center for Ethics and Culture's Marianne Remick Senior Visiting Fellow from 2015 to 2017. And we miss you very much, Michael. I'm glad to have you back. Less recently than that, he was also a Notre Dame undergraduate here, earning his BA here in philosophy. So we have kind of a pretty good reunion going on here, and pretty soon a tailgate will break out at any moment. But without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome David Schindler to the podium.
Thank you. It's really a treat to be back at Notre Dame here. And I wanted to begin, of course, with some thank yous. I wanted to thank first Carter Sneed for his bravery in taking on my book, a book with that sort of a title in his series, and welcoming it. And I'd like to thank the Center for Ethics and Culture more generally for hosting this great event. I'm really grateful for a chance to talk about my work here, and grateful to you all for making it in this weather. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists for taking the time to make the trip out here, and finally I want to thank Steve Wren from the press. It was really a delight working with him, and I'm grateful for the wonderful work they put into the book. I hope that you all win some sort of a award for the cover. I have to say, I'm continually astonished at how well that captures the spirit of the argument. I'm just going to take a few minutes to try to give a sense of the background of the book. It's not enough time to try to lay out the whole argument. But anyone who's read the book can tell I came very late to political philosophy. My background is actually in metaphysics and philosophical anthropology. I think you might be able to say I married into political philosophy. My wife did her degree in political theory here at Notre Dame, and it's been conversations with her that opened my horizons to the importance of political questions, which is why I dedicated the book to her. So one of the things that's odd about the book is it's an attempt to think about political questions from a very much a metaphysical perspective, and that makes it not so easygoing, I think. But it seems to me that in all of these fundamental problems, there are many dimensions, and the metaphysical dimension is always one of the central dimensions of any given cultural problem. And I think it's probably also one of the most neglected dimensions. So this book is an effort to approach a political question from a metaphysical perspective. And as long as I've been thinking at all, really, I've been struck by what has seemed to me to be the impoverishment and really destructiveness of the general concept of freedom as we understand it in the popular culture. That has always made a strong impression on me, and I resolved one day finally to try to think it through to its metaphysical and theological roots, to sort out thoughts on it and try to get to the root of the problem to the best of my abilities, however limited. So the structure of the book, I first wanted to discuss a root figure of liberalism. John Locke is if not the founding father of political liberalism. And then in the second part of the book, to try to articulate the metaphysical or theological conceptual core of what the problem seemed to me to be. And then the third part of the book is an attempt to retrieve the roots. So again, that word roots, to retrieve the roots of an alternative which happens also to be the original notion of freedom in the Western world. And so I present a study of the etymology of the term to try to open up a new direction, and in light of that original meaning of freedom as generosity, essentially, to offer an interpretation of Plato and Aristotle. So that's the basic structure of the book. I should add that this book is meant to be the first volume of a trilogy. And the reason that's important to say is I don't take Plato and Aristotle to be a solution to the problem of freedom. We've come a long way since then. The second volume that I'm already neck deep in research for is going to be the Christian appropriation of the classical tradition, and the fruits, achievements of that appropriation, but then also the failures and the problems that appropriation generated. I mean, in a certain sense, that book is going to try to trace out, at least in some detail, the how we got from Plato and Aristotle to Locke, sort of moving in the other direction. And then the third volume is going to be an attempt to do a constructive theory of freedom in response to the problem that's emerged through these two volumes. Finally, I just want to say a word about the conceptual core of the book. So I'm not going to trace out the argument, but just to try to characterize the problem in a nutshell, and then leave some space for the other speakers here. Essentially, there's a more abstract or metaphysical formulation of the core problem, and then one that's more concrete and intuitive. The metaphysical formulation, the more abstract formulation of what I take to be the problem in the modern conception of freedom is the inversion that it implies of the relationship between act and potency, the inversion of the classical interpretation of act and potency. So what does that mean? In the classical world, potency, power, potential, possibility, was always rooted in reality. It was always a fruit of reality. It was ordered to reality, connected some way, and therefore, in a way, given structure and form by reality. What we see in the modern conception of freedom, and Locke is just a paradigm of this, is an inversion of that relationship, that power now precedes reality rather than the reverse. And when you invert things like that, an extraordinary thing happens. On the one hand, our notion of power and potency and possibility becomes unfettered, unbounded, and therefore indeterminate. There's no natural measure to it. But paradoxically, and this is really a crucial point, because I think people often see that part of the problem. Paradoxically, by the very same token, it disappears. Potency was always understood as relatively real, and any reality that possibility has, it's always due to some connection with reality. But when you sever that connection, potency becomes completely unreal, and it seems to me that generates just an infinity of paradoxes that we see in our culture. In one respect, freedom is aggrandized beyond reason, beyond measure, but by the very same token, and often coincidentally, we have little regard for freedom. Freedom is completely crushed, overridden, and ignored by our institutions. And it seems to me that those aren't two competing issues. They're actually two sides of the same coin. That's what this book is trying to argue. Okay, so that's the more abstract formulation. The more intuitive one is this notion of the diabolical. Now, the Greek word, the Greek etymology of diabolical, as it happens, this was such a beautiful discovery when I stumbled onto this. As it happens, the etymological opposite of the diabolical is the symbolical. Symbol means a joining together, a uniting. And diabolical then, in its etymological roots, means a casting asunder, a setting at odds, a breaking apart. Using that couplet of the symbolical and diabolical, the book tries to sketch out a pre-modern, the classical world, which was essentially symbolical. Meanings joined people together. An emphasis on unity was at the foundation of our understanding of the political order. Whereas in the modern world, we try to create the conditions for freedom by separating out by splitting apart. You might think of the separation of church and state and how fundamental that is, the separation of the private and the public. These separations we take to be essential to freedom as we moderns understand it. And my argument is that there's a subtle, an unwitting set of problems that emerge from that. So the diabolical etymologically means casting asunder, setting apart, but I also draw on all of the connotations of the term and the tradition that has grown from it. The diabolical as the demonic, and in that vein, there's I suggest in this notion of the diabolical, I try to connect it with deception, counterfeit. The counterfeit double, as another philosopher puts it, a tendency to substitute an image for the reality, which then ends up in taking the place of the reality. Also, with the diabolical, this notion of the self-destructiveness of it that occurs because of this separation, and also in all sorts of ways that are fascinating, but also a bit frightening to think about. The diabolical as being a power kind of beyond our control. And it seems to me that that this notion of freedom that we've rested so much of our cultural institutions on has turned into a trap, has actually rather than being genuinely liberating of our humanity, has threatened it. So, in a nutshell, the proposal of the book is that the diabolical, this diabolical form, which is a way of interpreting freedom, this has been embedded into our most basic cultural values and institutions and patterns of life in ways that we don't pay attention to, and that this embedding of this problem in these institutions poses a very profound threat to our humanity. And when you hear that proposal, your first question is, and it's a great question, essential question, what can we do about it? How do we solve this problem? How do we get out of the problem? And that problem is too big for me. I don't address that so much in the book. Why? First of all, because it seems to me that to even begin to address that question fruitfully, we tend to skip to that far too quickly. To address that question fruitfully, we need to understand the problem. And so our very first effort needs to be to understand the problems at the root of our culture as fundamentally as we are able. And that's the task that this book sort of sets for itself. So thank you.
I know a number of you came in late, so I'm just going to announce the order again. We'll hear first from Professor Peter Simpson, and then from Adam Seagrave, and then from Professor Michael Moreland.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be back here at Notre Dame. I've been here several times. Last time was about a year and a half ago. It's a pleasure also to be speaking about this book, which David has explained something to you. It's a strange book. When I first received a copy of it and started reading through it, there's a passage about halfway through that struck me, and I read it to a number of acquaintances. And it goes as follows. A real center makes contact with a real center. This is the communication of being that occurs in the symbolical. But if the reality is only imitated in such a way that what is communicated is precisely separate from the essential, original, and originating center, then it, so to speak, calls on nothing more than the surfaces of the subject for its appropriation. Clear? All right? All right, now, this is a little unfair to David. It's in the middle of the book. You're supposed to read the opening pages to get the background to it. And actually, that sentence is saying something rather profound. But it's forbidding. Getting into the meaning takes time and effort. And this may be just because of the subject matter. But let me illustrate part of what I think he's driving at with the notion of freedom, which David thematizes using John Locke as his chief source. And he says at one point that for Locke, freedom is simultaneously dead and alive. And what he means is that for Locke, freedom is essentially the power of the will to suspend choosing any particular good, right? When you choose something, you're responding to a good. That's the traditional understanding. Locke says, yes, that's correct, that's desire, responding to the good. But there's no good that we are presented with and that we might desire that we cannot suspend, at least temporarily, from choosing. And for Locke, freedom is this not doing anything. It's a not doing anything, or a suspending, which, since it applies to every particular choice of good you might make, is universal and comprehensive. So it's totally alive. Anything whatsoever is free because you're not compelled to choose it. You can suspend judgment. But the suspension is itself a not doing something. So it's a kind of being dead. I throw that out there to stimulate you to go further into the analysis. Or there's another quotation, perhaps I can illustrate it. The unease that determines the mind is reality only in the form of unreality, which is the idea that you pursue something because you feel uneasy, you lack something. And that determines the mind because it is a certain lack of reality. Now, there's one point, there's a sense in which what David is saying here, vis-a-vis Locke, is not peculiar to Locke. It's true for the whole tradition. It's true of the great scholastic tradition, according to which there's no particular good that we can conceive which will entirely engage the will. Only the beatific vision is so supremely good that when you see it, you can't possibly refuse it. Any particular good whatsoever that you are aware of, you can say no to and choose a different good. To that extent, what David's talking about, what he says Locke is talking about, is universal to the tradition and not particular to Locke. Although it's given a particular spin in the way that Locke does it. I want to turn to another point from the book, which again I think illustrates the interest of the book and its the difficulty of penetrating it. This is David quoting Locke on property, where he says, all right, or we'll talk about the state of nature, but property is key to it. The original state, man's state of nature, is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending on the will of any other man. What Schindler notes about this definition is its externality, as he calls it. Freedom is creating a kind of boundary around your own action. within that boundary, you're free, and the main point of the definition is to say, up to this boundary you can go if you're someone else or the government, but you cannot penetrate into within the boundary. And it says nothing about what is within the boundary. That's left, as it were, just simply there. And the emphasis is on the externality. So my initial quotation, a real center makes contact with a real center. But if the reality is only imitated in such a way that what is communicated is precisely separate from the essential, original, and originating center, then it calls on nothing more than the surfaces of the subject for its appropriation. The Lockean definition is just touching the surface of freedom because it just concerns the boundary and doesn't talk about what's at the center, which is the essence of freedom, the free choosing of the good. Now that, I think, is an important insight, and it is something that David says, despite the peculiarity of which he says it. I want to end with a couple of other points, kind of a suggestion to David of how to make his points more pointed. The definition of the state of nature I gave to you from Locke is, as far as I can see, the first definition of the capitalist notion of private property. I may be wrong, so I stand to be corrected. The capitalist notion of private property is that ownership is exclusive. If you own something, it's yours, you can do whatever you want with. No one believed that. Well, actually, people acted on it, but no one gave a philosophical defense of a different view until Locke. Locke essentially overthrows the long-standing tradition that material goods have a common destination. If you have more material goods than you need, you owe them to the poor. The fact that you possess them doesn't make a difference. Your possession is never exclusive. Your surplus belongs to the poor. Locke's definition entirely rejects that. And as I say, I think it's the first one that does it. Locke invents the capitalist notion of private property, which is not the philosophical definition. It's not the Catholic definition. It's a totally new and distorting definition. In fact, it comes back to my final point. The essence of the kind of freedom we talk about today, and which David is rightly criticizing, is something very simple which you find almost everywhere. I find it all the time in my undergraduate classes. When I ask students what happiness is, they will say, well, whatever turns you on or whatever pleases me. It is the view that the good is the pleasant, and the pleasant being whatever is immediately pleasant. That is the dominant view in just about the whole world. Not just now, but probably from the beginning. You find it in Plato as well. The essence of liberalism is not so much metaphysical as political, my alternative account. There is no supreme good that is the same for all of us that can be known either by reason or revelation. The supreme good is whatever is good for you. Once you've got that as your notion of the good, the rest follows. You need your freedom to do exactly what you want in exclusion from what other people might be doing who are on the outside, the government or whoever it might be. So, thank you, David. Nice points, suggestions of how to take them.
Well, I'm also very happy to be here, both because it's always great to come back to Notre Dame, and also because it's an opportunity to discuss what I think is a really important and valuable book. So I'm really delighted to be here. I think Schindler's book makes a really valuable contribution to vibrant conversations going on right now regarding the relationship between Catholic Christianity and the modern world, broadly speaking. And I think his book really makes a valuable and important contribution to that conversation. I think his distinction between symbolism and diabolism, I suppose you might say, or the symbolic and the diabolical, is really profound and insightful, and so I thought that was a really good way to structure his argument, and I think he gives us a lot of insights into the symbolic nature of reality in its unified order to the good, and so I really appreciated that as well. Also, I think his interpretations of Plato and Aristotle are particularly persuasive and important and valuable. And that's not a backhanded criticism of his interpretation of Locke. I really do think that the Plato and Aristotle interpretations are really excellent. But I am, I think I'm sort of the Locke guy on the panel, and expected to give us somewhat a defense of John Locke. So I'll sort of do that, although not, I think, in the way that Locke himself would, perhaps. So. And I'm sympathetic as well in many ways to Schindler's argument in his book. So, but I think that if one were to make a sympathetic critique of Schindler's argument, one might start with a question that I had sort of overarching as I was reading the book, which is whether the book's focus on the symbolic nature of reality, on its ordered wholeness, on its internal harmony, on the order to the good, whether that focus might have led the book and Schindler to misidentify the source or locus of the diabolical sort of reality that it describes, right, or the diabolical denial of reality that it describes. As Schindler said, he finds this source in modern liberty, right? Modern liberty is the source of the diabolism that's there. It's the diabolical character of modern liberty, particularly in John Locke's thought as sort of paradigmatic expression of modern liberty. I would suggest perhaps as an alternative, though, that the source of the diabolism that's there, that Schindler, I think, very accurately describes, might not be in the idea of modern liberty itself, but rather in post-lapsarian reality itself, right? So, in other words, the fallen world, the world after the fall. Maybe this diabolical character is in the world after the fall rather than in the idea of modern liberty. And so modern liberty perhaps merely reflects, and at times reflects truthfully perhaps, on this reality, on this diabolical reality that we have after the fall. So this would mean that not all of the apparent contradictions that we see between the ancient sources Schindler describes, Plato and Aristotle, and the modern sources such as Locke, are actually contradictions. They might rather be sort of piecemeal reflections of a reality that is itself sort of in contradiction or is bifurcated into this original symbolic, harmonious and ordered reality that we have before the fall in the Garden of Eden as originally created by God. And then we also have the post-lapsarian, diabolical, disordered reality that we get after the fall, after original sin, and that the two coexist alongside one another in the time since the fall. Right? The one doesn't entirely supplant the other, but it coexists alongside it. So, for example, then, things like certain phenomena, like the split between desirability and obligation, the fact that we want things that we shouldn't want or shouldn't want in the way we want them, the distinction between the real and apparent good, the separation of potency and act that Schindler described initially, that sort of disjunction between potency and act. All of those things might, in fact, be characteristic phenomena of a post-lapsarian reality rather than an idiosyncratic invention of modern liberty. So Plato, Aristotle, St. Thomas, one might say that they focus more so on the original symbolic world of order to the good, of the natural sociability of human beings, of the naturalness of community, of those sorts of things, whereas Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, and others in the modern world focus more on the post-lapsarian diabolical reality of alienation from the good, from God, particularly alienation from others and from ourselves in many ways, and also in the limits of our understanding of the world, of the symbolic original world as a result of the fall, right? Of the effects of the fall on us. So in Machiavelli and Hobbes, and sometimes in Locke, I think that this focus on post-lapsarian reality does amount to a rejection of the original symbolic wholeness of the world before the fall. And so sometimes that rejection is there, and it sort of takes the form of the diabolical temptation to pride being a rejection of the symbolic obligation to obedience, right? And so I think that is there in many modern thinkers, but I don't think that it necessarily has to be there, and I think sometimes in Locke it's not. In other words, that it's not always a rejection of the symbolic order. So in setting up his discussion of Plato and Aristotle, Schindler asks a question that I think is illuminating on this very point. He asks, quote, "Is God creative and indeed so creative that he allows the goodness he gives to be co-determined by what is other than God? Does God allow us to share in his fruitfulness?" Now, in chapter 4 of the first treatise, paragraph 30 of the first treatise, Locke attempts, I think, an answer to this very question, which goes on to provide the roots of his political philosophy in the second treatise. So Locke says that, quote, "God makes man in his own image after his own likeness, makes him an intellectual creature, and so capable of dominion," end quote. So this very dominion is what Locke will go on to describe in chapter 5 of the second treatise in terms of property, the topic that Peter pointed us to, private property, dominion. And thereby, I think Locke draws a connection between God's creation of man, of the first actuality, one might say, of human beings, and human beings' subsequent power to own themselves, their actions, and property and external things. And I think it's this self-ownership that Locke describes in chapter 5 of the second treatise that ultimately is what we call human dignity. And I think that Locke sees that as both connected to our imitation of the Trinitarian God and also to human equality, the fact that we all possess this dignity. And it's actually a way of elaborating on our creation in the image and likeness of God that we own ourselves. At least I think that's the vision that Locke puts forward. Sort of that, God owns himself in the sense of being a community. And when he creates, with the Word, right? So, and the Word both is God and is with God. Similarly, when we act, when we think, we are both doing an action and we're with ourselves when we're doing it through our self-consciousness, through our sort of self-possession. So I think that's some of what Locke's getting at with the idea of self-ownership, which grounds his whole theory of ownership and explains to us what human dignity means. So it's true that Locke goes on to base his political philosophy on this idea of human beings acquiring property, on their power to acquire property, rather than on the order to the good and to virtue and to happiness. But this is because I think he's focusing on the question of the legitimacy of political power rather than the question of the highest goods attainable through politics. Those are just two different questions, and I don't think they're necessarily opposed to each other. I think they're just different questions. And the one focuses on human dignity, human freedom, and human equality, while the other focuses on virtue and happiness. And I think those are different focuses that are not necessarily opposed to one another. But I think which one you take to be more pertinent to politics, which question that is, depends closely on what you take to be the nature of the post-lapsarian world. Namely, does our world now partake more of the original, symbolical, harmoniously ordered reality of the Garden of Eden as originally created by God, or does our world now partake more of the diabolical, disordered reality introduced by original sin and the fall? And my sense in reading the book is that Schindler thinks the Garden of Eden reality is more pertinent and dominant for us. That sort of symbolical reality is the more important one. And though that ultimately may be right, I got the sense, too, in reading the book that the fall was maybe, it sort of seemed to be dodging the idea of the fall throughout. At least that was the sense I got. I kept wanting a direct encounter with the effects of the fall and somewhat missing it. So There is a really great place in the book where Schindler discusses the fall directly, called The Garden and the Cave. It was excellent, but he seems to blame the serpent for the fall rather than Adam and Eve, which I thought was interesting. It seems to be the focus is on the temptation of the serpent rather than on the sin of Adam and Eve. He goes on to compare the fallen state with Plato's cave allegory, saying that, quote, exile from the garden in the most extreme sense is separation from the good. The furthest distance from the garden may be said to lie at the bottom of Plato's cave, end quote, which I think is just a great statement, a really profound insight. But then rather than sort of following through with the connection between Plato's cave and the fallen world, Schindler replaces the fallen world with the idea of modern liberty, saying that the cave allegory, quote, is an intuitive expression of modern liberty as we have been describing it, end quote. And a couple of pages earlier, Schindler described something which was, quote, in sum, a deceptive and ultimately self-destroying illusion which cuts one off from, and indeed sets one in opposition to, God, the world, other people, the community as a whole, and in every analogous expression, and even oneself, end quote. Now, if this were a Jeopardy clue, I think many Christians, including people like St. Paul and St. Augustine, would buzz in right away and say, original sin, or pride, right? That's what you might answer. But Schindler has this be a definition instead of modern liberty, which I thought was interesting. And similarly, there seem to be moments throughout the book where he takes note of pre-modern anticipations of certain modern points of emphasis. Most importantly, Aristotle's extended discussion of akrasia, or incontinence, in Book 7 of the Ethics, St. Augustine's many discussions of man's sinful post-lapsarian state, only to sort of downplay their relevance as not terribly important. And one book that I thought should have made it in some form but didn't, that I can recall, is St. Augustine's Confessions. And that struck me as significant because in the Confessions, St. Augustine describes a sort of restlessness which is very reminiscent to me of Locke's unease. This restlessness that one has in our experience as fallen human beings in a world separated and alienated from God after original sin. So I found that to be a potentially important connection there to some of what Locke has to say, at least. So sort of to sum up then, I'm really sympathetic, I think, to the basic thrust of Schindler's argument that it's important to recover an idea of the symbolic wholeness of reality and its order to the good. And I'm as opposed to the diabolical rejection of actuality and goodness as the next guy. But I think the story might be more complicated, a bit more complicated than the one that the book gives us, particularly by two things: by the reality of the fallen world, and therefore of the partly diabolical nature of reality itself. And secondly, by the ability of certain moderns, such as Locke, to apprehend certain truths about the world, such as the truth of individual human dignity, as I understand it, by reflection on this diabolical, fallen side of reality. So, thank you.
Well, thanks to the Center for Ethics and Culture and the Tocqueville program, and to Carter Sneed and Patrick Dineen for the invitation to be here. And thanks to David Schindler for writing this book that brings us together. We miss him as a colleague at Villanova, and it's nice to be reunited with him here briefly. So a few years ago, I ran a series of summer workshops at Villanova sponsored by the Templeton Foundation on the themes of religious and economic liberty. And Patrick Dineen was one of the participants in that series of workshops. And over the course of the summer, we kind of coined together, I think Patrick came up with it initially, the term blessed liberalism to describe my own view, which was a kind of ironic, John Courtney Murray inflected kind of relationship between liberalism and Christianity. And I kept arguing that Locke wasn't really so bad. I even followed the great Catholic philosopher Peter Geach in saying that Hobbes gets a bad rap often. But I can't defend blessed liberalism in the few minutes I have now, and I do have to admit that things aren't going so well for liberalism, whether blessed or diabolical right now. And in part, that's because critiques of liberalism, most prominently, of course, Patrick Dineen's own blockbuster book, have captured an intellectual and cultural mood in the world right now. And I take David's book to be part of that project as well, albeit one that is dialed in more carefully on a particular figure in the liberal tradition, John Locke, and as has been discussed, offers much by way of metaphysical argument and an attempt at recovery through Plato and Aristotle. So in my brief 10 minutes here, I want to raise, 3 points, really kind of 3 constellations of questions. The first is a set of questions about contingency and causation in the history of ideas. The second are some questions about the manifestation of modern liberty in the society of devils, discussed in chapter 5 of the book. And then third, a question that I call, well, here we are, now what? So with regard to contingency and causation in the history of ideas, the book, as discussed, has a careful discussion of the views of John Locke in the Essay on Human Understanding and the second treatise on government. But I think a pressing question that I'm not sure the book ever really wrestles to the ground, although it may be an impossible question to do so adequately, is where did these ideas come from? I think there's a tendency, there's a kind of extreme tendencies toward either materialism or idealism, that on the materialist side, that ideas are just epiphenomenal and that all this is really about the state of the English wool trade in 1630 or something like that. But then there's also a danger of a kind of idealism, that these texts from a figure in the tradition like John Locke just sort of fall from the sky. And different academic disciplines, I think, kind of veer in one direction or the other. But without falling into either extreme, I think it's still important to inquire about the historical forces and motivations in play in the birth of this view about modern liberty. And so just to take the English part of the story, I should probably here defer to Peter since he's from England. But there's a long story to be told, of course, that doesn't get much time in the book about the history from the Tudors' accession after the War of the Roses and their tenuous grasp on power, through the Reformation, the 30 Years' War on the continent from 1618 to 1648, the crisis of the English Civil War, James II's failed effort at modern absolutism, culminating in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And so it seems to me that there are plural motivations in the birth of modern liberty that include economic, political, and scientific forces that it's important to attend to, and that if I wanted to push the argument a little further, I think in some ways help to explain, if not justify, some of the moves that figures like Locke made in this tradition, and that indeed modern liberty is in some important ways only possible because of its reaction to Christianity and to the world of Christendom that preceded it, and it creates, as Charles Taylor says, a kind of new mental world as a result. But again, I do think that attending to these questions of contingency and causation in the history of ideas is important. Secondly, then, about the Society of Devils of chapter 5, which is a discussion, for those who haven't read the book, about how the view of modern liberty that is advanced by Locke works itself out in especially in various political forms, starting with choice and self-determination and autonomy, and then culminating in rights, equality, freedom of thought, freedom of the press, and the right to vote. I think it's no mistake that in the book, the topics in that chapter start with the person and the person's own powers of choice and self-determination and autonomy under this diabolical view of modern liberty. And then the discussion moves out to institutional features of modern liberty, such as voting and rights and the like. But it does seem to me it's important also to attend to the ways in which modern liberty, including the Lockean variation, is also about institutional limitations on the power of the state. And you see this, I think, with some early uses of liberty in English political thought that were primarily institutional. So there was the liberty of the church, which was first the Catholic Church, and then the liberty of the Church of England, and then a kind of toleration of other sects as well. The liberty of Parliament, the ancient liberties of the Commons. Note, for example, that freedom of speech was initially freedom of speech in Parliament, as expressed in the English Bill of Rights in 1689. The liberty of the university is actually one of the sort of crisis moments leading to the Glorious Revolution, was James II's efforts to install leaders of colleges at Cambridge. And so also with our discussion of rights, and I can't do much on this point here, but just to say that I do think it's at least arguable that there's more continuity between the medieval use of the term use and our modern understanding of rights as a shorthand for claims about justice and what is owed to one another that is not necessarily beset by the diabolical errors that David diagnoses. So very briefly then here at the end, here we are now what? And here I will be very brief. I think it's a common question in these conversations dating back to MacIntyre's After Virtue and other books that I think are part of this series of powerful critiques of liberalism, is if liberty is diabolical in David's framing, if liberalism has indeed failed, as Patrick argues, then what is the answer to that? What do we do now? And here I gather we're anticipating some of what David will talk about in the successor volumes. But I also think it's important to, and here I again rip a page from Charles Taylor in Sources of the Self in the Secular Age, that insofar as Christianity set the stage for liberalism and modernity, modern liberty then is a dialectical reaction to Christianity, and we're still living amid that moment. But there's no going back. There's only going through this moment. And what that looks like, those of you who've read, for example, Taylor's The Secular Age know that even he doesn't have a sort of crystal clear answer on what happens now in the wake of the sort of failure of aspects of modernism. But I do think, again, that there's no going back, only through this moment. And so to the extent that David will tell us what it looks like to go through this moment in volumes 2 and 3, I look forward to that as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your attentive reading of the heavy book and your comments, both your kind comments and the questions that you raise. I appreciate them very much, and I don't want to take too much time. I'll just briefly respond to a point or two in each, and we hope to open up to questions that others might have here. Briefly, Peter's pointing out that the notion in Locke of the suspension of judgment, not freedom consisting in this, in a way, not being compelled by any particular thing, so that one has the power to basically to choose whatever one wishes. Peter mentioned that that's something that can be found in the whole classical tradition. One sees it very clearly, he said, in scholasticism, this notion that the only compelling good, this is from Aquinas, because there's some controversy on this point, the only fully compelling good is the beatific vision, and everything else as less than that doesn't compel us. And so, in a certain sense, we have a certain power over. We're not forced to make any particular choice. That's absolutely true. What I want to highlight, though, is that there's a profound difference in the way Locke understands that and in the way the classical tradition does, and there's so much that hangs on this. For Locke, the question is attraction. In the classical conception, even if a particular good that is not heaven itself doesn't force itself on me, it nevertheless already, insofar as it's good, moves me. I'm involved in it. I'm already moving towards it. And so my choice of it is going to have something of a consent to a movement that's already begun, rather than beginning from an absolute zero without anything moving me and having my choice be the sole source ex nihilo of this movement towards the good. And that's what I suggest you get in Locke and modern philosophers. You can find this in many of them. So in the classical tradition, you think of responding to the good as something like responding to a partner in a dance. It requires your response. You have to be involved, or else the dance doesn't work. And so your participation, your active participation, is indispensable. And yet, what form does that take? There's a kind of responsiveness in your participation. You move with the dancer, and you're being moved by the dancer in your moving yourself. So that that's symbolical. That's what the symbolical means, a joining together. There's a unity there. It's very different from being, clicking options on a screen that has that's not pulling you. You're there, separated. That's the diabolical. And your movement then is, so this is where the language of force, will, power enters the picture, which was not part of the classical tradition. When they spoke about a power, it was the power to be actualized, to be realized by some reality that was drawing me. Okay, with regard to Adam's primary point, which I appreciate very much, he pointed out that the diabolical doesn't begin in Locke. It's part of the post-lapsarian world generally. I agree entirely with that. It's not, the argument isn't that Locke caused all of these problems at all. He's meant to just represent something. Obviously, man didn't fall in John Locke, but in Adam and Eve. But what I take to be particular about, and so the entire classical tradition recognized these elements of the diabolical, separation from the good, all these things that I've been characterizing here. What's the difference? In John Locke, these become not elements of disorder and evil. They actually become excellences. They become virtues. They become ideals. That's scary, right? When what the classical tradition had identified as sin and evil actually is presented as an ideal and an ordering principle of society. And that's something that's new, I would suggest. Okay, there could be a lot to be said about that. And finally, with regard to Mike's pointing our attention to the complexities of the history and the movement of ideas, that's something I also agree. It's a point very well taken. There was not an attempt to trace the causes. The argument in the book wasn't where did this come from, who's responsible for giving us this particular conception. It wasn't an intellectual history tracing the development of ideas. The point was to take a particular moment and look at the essence of it. So you might say formal causality rather than efficient causality. What does modern liberty look like? I think the question of where does it come from and the intellectual part of that, the economic part of that, the social part of that, all of those are part of the origin. But it's the origin of something, and the main effort of the book was to try to just articulate what that something is. There'll be a little more of the genealogy in the second volume, I hope, but anyway, I won't get into that now. But that's all I have to say in response to those comments, but I think we're going to open it up, perhaps.
Terrific. Do we need to turn these mics on? Is that just a switch on the top? Okay, thank you. So you can respond from your seats. So I'd like to open things up, and it's a tradition in both the Center for Ethics and Culture and the Tocqueville Program in Constitutional Studies to invite students who might like to ask a question first. And please, just if you would identify yourself, maybe your year and your what you're studying. It'd be lovely to hear from you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Ian. I am a math and philosophy calculator. I was just wondering, there was talk about this dialectic or antithesis between Christendom and modern liberty and the conception thereof. And I'm just wondering what you all think. Is the answer to this a synthesis of both of them, or sort of a mutual conflict between them that these cannot coexist? So is the answer, like, I know you've all said like that finding an answer is hard, but this is, I think, the easiest question out answer. Do we move forward or do we move backward? Because a synthesis seems more plausible, but also maybe it could just be that these two conceptions are so mutually opposed that they cannot coexist. Okay,
I'll just repeat the question for the recording. The question is, It seems that what's being presented is two versions of liberty, kind of Christian or pre-modern understanding of liberty and a modern conception of liberty you find in Locke. And the student, Ian, asks, should we be looking more for a synthesis of these two, or are we looking in some senses for a kind of a restoration, in particular of a Christian or pre-modern conception of liberty? And anyone who would like to answer this question, but maybe primarily David in this case.
Do you want to go first?
Unless you have something right now.
Well, I would just repeat what I said myself, that I think the essence of modern liberty is the good is the pleasant, which is the crudest and oldest notion of the good, which thinkers have been competing against from the beginning. Plato and Aristotle are doing it. What's the solution? Well, there is no grand solution. There are particular solutions that work in particular places at particular times. And you do what you can in the here and now to introduce the idea that there is a supreme good that's one and the same for all of us, and that's what life is about. It's not about pursuing your particular pleasures. They need disciplining, not following. How do you do that? Well, you start with mum and dad, and then the church, I think, is a very important role, but that's it. You just do what you can with what you got, and it varies according to the circumstances.
I think that's very well said. Should I, yeah.
Well, yeah, I might just offer a counterpoint, if I may, because I think that is the solution. I mean, I think the synthesis is the solution, and that's partly because I think that there's a truth at the core of modern liberty, which is something like the idea of human dignity and natural rights, and that explains, as I said, I mean, I think explains partly creation in the image and likeness of God, and I think that in many ways the consequences and the pathologies of modern liberty are very much opposed to Christianity and to pre-modern ideas of goodness. But I think if it were possible, and I think Tocqueville provides some insight into this, but if it were possible to maintain the core truths of modern liberty while jettisoning the elements of it that are inimical to the tradition and to Christianity, that would provide the solution. I don't know whether that's possible, but I think that is the solution. Might be.
Yeah, it's not, first of all, a question of going back. That never makes any sense. I mean, that's just an impossibility. It doesn't make any sense. But I would want to push this a bit. I think even the question of are there good things, elements in modern liberty that are worth holding on to, I would want to qualify that. I wouldn't concede that immediately. I mean, this would be a bit provocative, but it seems to me, first of all, that a lot of these discussions tend to have a historical naivete behind them, by which I mean there's a failure to recognize that the birth of modern liberty is connected with the rejection of Christianity. That's where it comes from. Let me qualify, Catholic Christianity. But I would say that the only kind of Christianity that it allows is a modern reversion of Christianity, which I would suggest is the Protestant, the various Protestant churches are, in a certain sense, refashioning Christianity on a different foundation. And that one works with modern liberty. It defines it, really. And that's why it's not compatible with a Catholic notion. Now, does that mean that we simply reject it wholesale? Absolutely not. Why? Because modern liberty, precisely as this, what's the point of the diabolical is that it's not real. And if it's not real, it means that, in a certain sense, it's never a thing that we have to do battle with. Reality is always here, always, it surrounds us. We can't, so it seems to me that there are going to be all sorts of wonderfully, beautifully important ideas that we find in modern liberty, but I would suggest that those are traces of reality that have survived in a way because this privation, I mean the classical privation theory of evil, it can never be absolutized. It's always parasitical on what's good and real, and so that there will be good things, but they don't come from the rejection of Christianity. They can't.
Just 2 seconds on that. I would pose the alternatives less starkly. You wouldn't be surprised to know. But on Ian's question, I do think that maybe one way of bringing it back would be to say that it's a question that I think evades theoretical resolution, and that it depends upon practices and institutions and ways of living that that, as I say, can't undo what the last 400 or 500 years have accomplished or failed to accomplish. But that, and that's why, as a law professor, I mean, I think that, the way in which the normal workings out of legal institutions, the ways in which universities, the ways in which in your local communities you wrestle with these questions is where the resolutions will come, and that it's a kind of mistake, though, to think that there's a tidy historical or theoretical or philosophical explanation that can kind of put all this in one place.
I'm obligated to call on Professor Sneed, Carter Sneed.
David, I thought part of the real force of your critique is following what you were just talking about, namely the defect of modern liberty and its detachment from reality, right? And one area in which you discuss that, in I think very beautiful ways, on the question of technology. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between ancient conceptions of techne and the givens of nature, and even more beautifully, the reaction as a kind of posture of gratitude towards the givens of nature versus the sort of instrumental and extractive and sort of annihilating approach of modern technology. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Let me just restate the question. This is from Professor Carter Sneed, who would like Professor Schindler to speak on, in particular, a passage in the book that discusses technology, and in particular contrasting ancient understandings of technology, techne, as in some ways an interaction with the given, and requiring a kind of response of gratitude, as opposed to modern forms of technology, which tend to be instrumentalizing, extractive, and exploitative.
That's really a crucial point to the whole argument, really, and will help synthesize something. My response to your question would piggyback on the response I gave earlier to the point that Peter had raised, the difference between the modern and the ancient notion of the will. The modern notion of the will as a kind of a power or force acting on things, and the ancient sense of the will as a being moved by the goodness of things, to which then one gives one's consent. And this shows up in the different conceptions of techne, technology. The ancient notion of techne is very much, it begins by the notion that nature is good, so reality is good. And because it's good, it draws us in, but it draws us in precisely as creative human beings. And so we're drawn into the natural world, but in a way that we help it to flourish. We make something out of it. We in a certain sense draw on its own resources and energies and actualities and bring those to a certain flourishing, like a farmer tending a field. He's not making vegetables, he's raising them. He's using his activity in a way that draws them out of the good earth. The modern notion tends to begin from a notion of reality as neutral, and therefore not as drawing us in, but in a certain sense raw material that we simply act on from the outside, and there's no our activity in that sense is never going to be a kind of a transformation of things. It's always going to have a kind of a violence to it. I think that's there would be a historical discussion that could begin here, thinking about the different ways that the rise of with the Industrial Revolution and so forth, how that transformed things. One of the most interesting dimension of all of this is the more contemporary. When we say technology, we tend not to think of steam engines. We tend to think of things like Facebook and social technologies, and it seems to me that poses a much more fascinating and rich set of problems, but they're similar, because there's still this separation from reality. I mean, what's the essence of our social technologies is communicating without contact, Yeah, that bears some reflection.
Also, maybe has some technological implications.
Oh, right, of
Yeah,
course,
yeah,
of course.
yeah. Professor Philpott.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating book, which I can't wait to read. But I wanted to ask a question about your kind of historical story. Like you said it a minute ago about modern liberty being a rejection of Christianity. And I think of an address that Pope Benedict XVI gave us, I think it was his 2005 Christmas address, where he was talking about the church's long road to dignitatis humanae. And to be sure, the church very much, rejected, as it did in the 19th century, when popes rejected liberty altogether, right? Very stentorian terms. But the church has continued to reject the kind of philosophical version of the Enlightenment. And yet, I think particularly in the 20th century, it came to adopt kind of certain institutional forms of liberty, the civil rights and the human rights as articulated in the human rights documents and so forth. And in a sense, that kind of synthesis culminates in dignitatis humanae. So you have liberty in the sense of the kind of institutional sense, but it's they found a way to kind of grand dialectic to put it on a very different philosophical foundation. I think a number of Catholic thinkers could also maybe be seen as participating in that same project. Think like Maritain, Yves Simon, John Henry Newman in some ways, Luigi Sturzo. So in other words, this possibility of liberty but on different foundations. What do you think about that?
So just to summarize Professor Dan Philpott's question, he's interested in asking whether there's not in some ways a kind of grand dialectic that the church itself has ultimately embraced in a relationship with modern liberty, in as much as in particular the development coming out of such documents and leading up to documents like Dignitatis Humanae reconcile in some ways with particularly institutional forms of liberty, and in particular maybe especially religious liberty among other liberties, and wondering whether that's maybe another way of thinking about the church's relationship to modern liberty, not simply in this conflict, but ultimately a kind of dialectical relationship. And Professor Moreland is nodding his head in firm agreement.
Yeah, I suspect my response to this will be you won't appreciate so much. You'll have some things to say about in any event. I mean, obviously, the Dignitatis Humanae has been a controverted document from its inception, and I don't know if you were a kind of a critical edition has appeared just recently with my father and another colleague, Nicholas Healy, put it together that presented the various drafts and traced out the history of the debates and the discussions that went on, and then offer an interpretation. And when you look at it, you see that I think it would require a certain qualification of the idea of Dignitatis Humanae being a culmination of a certain movement, which suggests that things come to a beautiful synthesis there. But when you see how the sausage was made, you realize that there were competing elements in the construction of that, and the competing elements are, on the one hand, it was essentially the French versus the Americans. You had John Courtney Murray on the one hand, and then you had the French and Karol Wojtyła on the other, representing very different conceptions, and the resulting document doesn't seem to have actually resolved the tensions that were there, which is one of the reasons there's so much controversy. One might say that Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, and then Benedict XVI represented a certain interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae in a direction that moved away from John Courtney Murray's interpretation. I know that there's a lot of debate about that, but in light of the argument here, I think it would be interesting to think about that tension as one between a desire to recognize certain elements actually within the long tradition on the one hand, or refounding a notion of freedom on different presuppositions, which I would say was what Murray was doing, and that would, I mean, for my own part, I would want to resist that.
We're going to go on a quarter of, so I have a question from Professor Mary Keyes.
Discussion so far, and I want to go by the book, so I haven't read the book yet. But Professor Schindler, you mentioned in your comments that you understand freedom, especially to be generosity. And I
Professor Keyes asks if Professor Schindler would amplify and maybe explain a little further his what I think he mentioned in his talk which is freedom as generosity.
Yeah, that was sparked initially by this puzzling question that I had never seen adequately answered, so it seemed, which is, why the virtue of liberality in Aristotle. I mean, it's a virtue that has the word freedom built into it. And what is liberality? It's generosity, magnanimity. And what's the connection between those two things? That's a question that doesn't seem to get raised. But an answer suggests itself when you look at the etymology of the term. There's a deep connection between the word freedom and fertility. And a kind of an outpouring of the good is what I eventually say. Now that original notion had a you might say a more natural interpretation initially. Freedom meant belonging to a particular people, and so that there was this sort of bloodline that ran through everyone and gathered them together. But what you get in Plato and Aristotle is it seems to me what the interpretation here is a taking over of that notion in more metaphysical terms. It's not simply belonging to a bloodline, but belonging to the good. And therefore belonging to each other in the good. And that belonging takes the form of, in the first, the highest form, as you asked, is that the highest form of freedom? I think that's the highest instance, is this, God's freedom is his creating of the world, the supreme liberality. But it seems to me it's starting from that point. You can actually make sense of various things like initiative, choice, participation, as expressions of this fruitfulness. And they become very different if you think of them on the basis of generosity than if you generate them ex nihilo as just pure powers on the other hand. So that's a basic part of the argument. Thank you for the question.
I've seen two hands, so why don't I take two questions? We'll go with Professor Hitz, and I'm not sure your name, but why don't you introduce yourself and then ask a question, and we'll follow it up with your question, and we'll finish up.
I'm Dineen. I'm a fellow this semester at the Center for Ethics and Culture. I wanted to take up the objection from this end of the table a little bit from two directions. On the one hand, that in Plato and Aristotle, if we take them seriously as sources on their own, the environment attribute something like modern liberty to democratic Athens, which resonates also with Thucydides, imperialism, things like that. So we see whatever the philosophers say, that it's likely to have been a part of lived reality of the ancient world, something like that. On one hand. On the other hand, looking at the contemporary scene, there strikes me as an enormous amount of anxiety in the secular world about technology, about compulsive behaviors. There's millions of people who are seeking to be free from compulsions, whether it's alcohol, drugs, pornography, the internet. And there's a general anxieties about consumerism. And so I suppose I wonder whether these aren't features of the human condition more than they are something which is historically bound.
And we'll take the other question here. Well, and I'll ask the panelists to respond to both. And sure.
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm a med student from across the road. So I know none of the verbiage to use correctly, but it seems like a lot of the cardinal sin of liberalism nowadays. It seems like the kind of infinite relativism that came up kind of like 20th century France. I feel like is when it really kicked off. But with like Foucault, there's a name that's thrown around a lot. It seems like those things came about because we've taken these ideas that like originated in these societies that were themselves like very small, insular. The Greeks could only agree that they were all humans when the Persians invaded, and then otherwise they were all killing each other. And like same thing with the English, the English have these grand philosophical ideas, except for the French, who are just defraud, right? So like it seems like, and this is something that the colleague from UK mentioned, that like you kind of do what you can with the tools you have available, and it starts with the mom and dad, and then you have like this good that you're shooting for. And that almost seemed to me like a statement of liberalism, right? Like that there wasn't like, because as soon as you say to a group of people who don't come from a Western background, here is the idea of good that comes from this tradition, this Western tradition, maybe they go, okay, well I get that, but then you start adding on like kind of the rules that we've developed over a couple thousand years, and then you just start losing people. And so I guess what I'm getting at is like, yeah, liberalism's gone too far, but I guess it's getting back to that earlier question: do we throw the baby out with the bathwater, or do we just kind of, ratchet it back a bit? Not infinite relativism, but rather like, okay, mostly relativism. We're all shooting towards this great good, and kind of do it however you need to on a small level.
Okay. So I'll take the second question first, just to summarize. I think to boil it down would be, is it necessary to leave the liberal paradigm, or in some ways rather to understand that it's gone too far, perhaps in its kind of postmodern relativist direction, and might it not be possible in some ways to sort of pull back and to sort of moderate liberalism from within the paradigm of liberalism, blessed liberalism? Zena Hitz asks a question, a really fascinating question, that in some ways you could say you can find in the ancient world and in ancient philosophers a conception of modern liberty, particularly as described, for example, by Plato in Book 8 in particular, Book 8 and 9, that you find a form of modern liberty exemplified in a sort of democratic setting, and so that form of liberty has sort of always existed. Whereas in the contemporary setting, what you find is in some ways maybe a kind of, in the anxieties over technology and compulsiveness and addiction and consumerism, you find sort of examples of what you might think of as concerns that might lead us to more ancient forms of liberty. So might the story in some ways be more mixed? And it strikes me as these two questions are in some ways interestingly related. But if anyone is interested in tackling those aspects, please do so when we'll finish up.
Okay, I'll try to be succinct. Actually, to go with Dr. Hicks' question first, there are certainly elements of modern liberty, or what we associate with modern liberty in the ancient world, as you pointed out. The question for me would be what it's not so much this little idea or this notion. It's how they're integrated and what's the foundation, what's the principle that's animating the understanding. And it seems to me in the ancient world, and very clearly in Plato and Aristotle, these elements are there, but they're not the ordering principles of society. They're integrated within a much more fundamental order. And I think that's the only way that these things that are very precious, like choice and self-determination, can actually exist. I mean, ironically, I would suggest that the very kinds of problems that you talked about, these addictions and these profound forms of slavery. I mean, one of the arguments one of the principal arguments of the book is that those things, I think, are encouraged and reinforced precisely by our particular conception of freedom. So that they're almost expressions of the very problem that's at the root of things. So I think it would be a similar point to make. It's what's the foundational integrating principle. I think that rooting everything in the generosity of the good doesn't leave. In the end, it really doesn't leave anything out. So I think that is an adequate starting place, and that's something that resonates with every human being, qua human being, it seems to me. That doesn't preclude the diversity of cultures that have incarnated this freedom in their own particular ways. I mean, not in the least. I think the more deeply rooted our conception of freedom is, the more diversity we would have in cultures, actually. So there's no threat in that at all.
Just a quick comment or two. you mentioned democracy, ancient democracy, as having, no, sorry, excuse me, I get the wrong person. Yes, in fact, Aristotle quotes Euripides to the effect that in democracy, each person lives according to what they crave. Yeah, okay, the good is the pleasant. That's the very essence of it. That's the essence of modern liberty. All we've done in the modern world is cover it over with fancy theories. Foucault, for instance. I mean, Foucault's saying saying nothing new. It's just fancy theory behind it. What do you do with it? I don't know. We're facing the same problem we've always faced. I think it's actually a pragmatic problem, which is why Dignitatis Humana is not doctrine, but pastoral advice.
Well, I guess in response to both, that it does strike me that, to go back to my first part, that more emphasis on contingency and history and less on theory is a welcome antidote here. And it's not, I don't mean that as a critique of David necessarily, but I do think that, so that Dignitatis Humanae, for example, is a response to a particular moment, and one that we're still living in response to figuring out what is the church's own self-understanding of religious freedom, and how do other political institutions understand religious freedom, and that sometimes the theory lags behind that.
Any last words?
No.
All right, well, I think you said everything you came here to say. Well, with that, so I think, just to close out, this book, which is a really remarkable achievement, I think just even from this conversation today, we can see what a remarkable reflection it is on not merely theory, but as I think all of us have expressed in various ways, a really felt sense that something needs to be done and thought and reflected upon. And I think I can think of no better person to help us do that than David Schindler in this book. And frankly, I can think of no better place to do this than here at the University of Notre Dame. So I want to thank all of you today for coming out in otherwise treacherous weather, and thank especially our guests for joining us here today.